There is a difference between a dog that is lost and a dog that has decided to stay. And Thomas Beartooth understood this distinction. The moment he crested the rise at the eastern edge of his grandfather's land and saw the white dog sitting in the tall grass beside the dry creek bed, enormous and motionless, facing away from him, watching something in the grass below with the focused, patient attention of a creature that has assigned itself a responsibility and intends to keep it. She was not wandering. She was not frightened. She was exactly where she had chosen to be, and the choosing was evident in every line of her body. Thomas stood on the rise for a long moment, watching her watch the grass, and then he heard the sound from the creek bed, a high, thin chorus that a man who had grown up on the Crow Reservation in eastern Montana recognized immediately, and he understood then what she was guarding and why she had not moved, and what it meant that she had stayed. If this story finds you tonight, tell us in the comments which city you are watching from, and subscribe to this channel before we go further, because what Thomas Beartooth found in that dry creek bed on his grandfather's land was not simply the beginning of something between a man and a dog. It was the beginning of a man finding his way back to a version of honor that made sense, after spending 3 years trying to determine whether such a version still existed. Thomas Beartooth was 44 years old, and he had the face of someone who had been paying close attention for a very long time and had found what he was paying attention to increasingly difficult to look at directly. He was tall and lean, with dark eyes and high cheekbones and black hair he kept pulled back, a face that people in his SEAL team had described as unreadable, and that his grandfather described more accurately as a face that was reading everything at once and not yet sure what the reading meant. He had grown up at Crow Agency, on the Absolute Nation land in eastern Montana, the grandson of a man named Alfred Beartooth, who had farmed the same 40 acres for 60 years and had the kind of authority that comes not from position but from having been in one place long enough to become part of its grammar. Thomas had left at 18, drawn not by rejection of where he came from but by the specific hunger of a young man who needed to know what he was capable of before he could know who he was, and the Navy had provided a reasonably comprehensive answer to that question over the course of 20 years and 3 combat deployments, and a career that had ended at 41 with a chest of commendations and a moral injury. So specific and so carefully located that he could tell you exactly which night it had entered him, and had not yet been able to tell you how to make it leave. The operation had been legal. The target had been confirmed. The intelligence had been assessed as reliable. What had not been assessed with sufficient weight, and what Thomas had raised in the pre-mission briefing and been overruled on, was the probability of civilian presence in the structure adjacent to the primary target. And the assessment had been wrong, and the civilians had been present, and Thomas had been the one closest to that structure when the mission concluded. And the things he had seen when he looked inside had been with him every day since, in the specific way that certain images become permanent. Not memories you access, but facts about the world that you carry. He had been cleared. He had been counseled. He had been recommended for continued service and had instead submitted his retirement paperwork 3 months later because the recommendation had felt like a door closing over something that deserved to stay open. He had come back to Crow Agency because his grandfather Alfred was 84 and managing 40 acres alone, and because Thomas had nowhere else to be that carried a reason he could articulate, and because the land he had grown up on was the only place he had ever been, where the silence felt like it was offering something rather than simply withholding it. Alfred Beartooth was 84 years old and had the quality of very old men who have stopped filtering what they say because they have determined the remaining time is too short for indirection. He was small, bent slightly at the shoulder now, with white hair he kept in 2 braids and eyes that were still sharp enough to make younger men uncomfortable when he turned them on something he was assessing. He did not discuss Thomas's reasons for coming home because he considered them obvious, and because discussing obvious things was a use of time he had never been able to justify. He put Thomas to work on the fence line the first morning, and on the irrigation system the second morning, and on the roof of the equipment shed the third morning, and by the end of the first week Thomas had more than enough physical occupation to prevent his mind from running the sequence it had been running for 3 years, which was the closest thing to peace he had found. And Alfred observed this without commenting because Alfred had been managing wounded men returning from wars since before Thomas was born and knew which tools were useful. The white dog was a Great Pyrenees, approximately 3 years old, with a coat the color of heavy cream that had gone rough and grass-stained from weeks on the open land, and eyes that were a warm, pale amber, almost golden, that gave her an expression of absolute calm competence, as if she had done an assessment of the situation and found it within her capability to manage. She weighed, when Thomas eventually got her to the veterinarian in Hardin, just under 90 pounds, which was light for her frame, and she had been on her own for long enough that her pads had toughened significantly, and her ribs were visible beneath the thick coat when you pressed your hands against her sides. She had no microchip and no collar, and the veterinarian, a practical woman named Dr. Ellen Shaw, who had been doing large animal work in Carbon and Bighorn counties for 20 years and small animal work as a secondary occupation that had gradually become primary, could find no record of a missing Great Pyrenees in the regional network. She had been bred, Dr. Shaw noted, for exactly what she was doing. Great Pyrenees were livestock guardian dogs, mountain dogs, bred over centuries to stay with a flock through whatever the landscape offered and to drive off threats without being asked. And the fact that she had been guarding a family of coyote pups rather than sheep was, Dr. Shaw said with a slight smile, probably more commentary on the dog's character than on her confusion about the assignment. What Thomas had found in the creek bed, when he came down the rise and parted the tall grass, were 5 coyote pups, approximately 4 weeks old, alive and vocal and pressing together in the shallow cavity where their mother had denned, their mother's body 20 yards away in the grass where something had ended her, and the white dog sitting between them and the open land in the posture of a guardian who had arrived after the fact, but had decided that arriving after the fact did not eliminate the obligation. She had not harmed them. She had not adopted them in any sentimental sense. She had simply determined that they were small and present and without protection, and had placed herself in the relevant position. And she looked at Thomas when he parted the grass with the steady amber gaze of an animal reporting a situation to a superior and waiting for further orders. He stood in the creek bed for a long time without giving any. He called the Montana Fish and Wildlife Service, who sent a wildlife officer named Pete Crow, no relation, who collected the pups for rehabilitation with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had done this before and appreciated that the dog had kept them alive and said so plainly. Thomas took the white dog back to his grandfather's land because the alternative was leaving her in the creek bed with nothing to guard, and he did not think that was fair, and she came with him without resistance, walking beside him with the unhurried stride of a dog that has decided on her companion and considers the matter settled. Alfred saw them coming across the south field and stood in the yard watching without expression until they reached the gate, and then he looked at the white dog for a long moment and said, "She stayed, in Absoluk." He named her Siku, which was not Absoluk but Inuktitut, the Arctic word for ice, because her coat in the morning light on the Montana plain had that quality, white that held other colors depending on where the light came from, and because naming things after what they looked like in a specific light was something his grandmother had done, and he wanted the name to carry something he was not ready to say directly. Siku went with him on the fence line and on the irrigation work and on the roof repairs, lying in the grass below and watching him with her golden eyes, and in the evening she lay at his feet on the porch while he and Alfred sat in the cooling September air, and Alfred talked about the land in the way he talked about it, not as property or resource, but as context. The ground everything else had happened on, the thing that remained after the people and their decisions were gone. Thomas listened and said little, which was the correct response, and Siku's weight against his feet was the kind of physical fact that made it easier to be in a body he had spent 3 years treating as a liability. In October, Alfred had a fall in the equipment shed. Nothing catastrophic. A hip bruised badly enough to require 2 weeks of reduced activity and a visit from the Indian Health Service nurse who came out twice that week and told Thomas what he already knew, which was that 84-year-old men who farmed alone needed more help than pride typically allowed them to request. Thomas had been providing that help for 4 months, but the fall clarified something about the permanence of the arrangement that the previous 4 months had left slightly ambiguous, and the clarification was not unwelcome. He called his cousin Raymond in Billings, who came out the following weekend, and his Aunt Doris, who organized a rotation of family members for the weeks Alfred needed rest. And the way the family moved into the task without ceremony or drama reminded Thomas of something he had been trying to remember for 3 years, which was that belonging to something did not require you to have done everything right. It required you to show up when the showing up was needed. Siku, during Alfred's recovery, attached herself to the old man with the specific, professional dedication of a livestock guardian that has been given a new assignment and intends to take it as seriously as the last one. She lay outside Alfred's bedroom door at night and beside his chair during the day and walked the perimeter of the house yard in patterns that Thomas recognized from his training as actual patrol routes. Not restless pacing, but systematic coverage. Alfred observed this with approval and called her, in absolute, the White Soldier, and she accepted this title with the composure of someone who considered it accurate. The two of them developed an arrangement that required no translation. Alfred talked to her in the language he had spoken for 84 years, and Siku listened with the focused attention she gave to everything, and the listening appeared to be entirely sufficient for both of them. The conversation Thomas had with his grandfather in November, the one he had been building toward since he arrived in June, happened on a cold, clear evening when the sky over the high plains was the color of a bruise turning yellow at the edges, the last light hanging on the horizon. Alfred had been quiet for a long time, which with Alfred meant he was about to say something that required the silence before it. He said, in absolute, that a warrior who carries a wound he did not choose still carries the wound, and that the wound is not the same as the wrong. Thomas did not answer immediately, because the sentence required the space that Alfred had learned to give things. Siku pressed against Thomas's leg in the cooling air. The horizon held its color for another minute and then let it go. Thomas said, slowly, that he was not sure he knew how to be the person he thought he was before that night. And Alfred said that was correct. He was not that person. He was the person who came after that night, and that person was also permitted to live with honor if he chose to, and that the choosing was the part that was his. He said also that the white dog had chosen to stay beside something she could not save, and had then stayed beside the next thing, and the thing after that, and that this was not weakness or confusion, but a different kind of faithfulness than the kind that required a clean outcome, and that Thomas already knew how to do this because he had been watching her do it for 4 months. Siku's weight against his leg did not change, which was the point. Some things guard what they find because guarding is what they know how to do, and they do not require the thing they are guarding to make sense before they begin. Thomas Beartooth came home to 40 acres and an old man, and the kind of silence that offers something if you are willing to stay in it long enough, and what arrived in the tall grass by the dry creek bed was a white dog who had decided that small and present and unprotected was sufficient reason to stay, and who applied this principle to everything she encountered afterward, including a man who had been trying for 3 years to determine whether he was worth the effort. He had not resolved the question. He was still carrying the wound, but the wound was no longer the only thing he was carrying, and on the high plains of eastern Montana in the winter, with Alfred's land under a clean foot of snow, and Siku's white coat invisible against it until she moved, Thomas Beartooth understood that this was not a small thing. It was, in fact, precisely enough to continue. If this story reached you tonight, share it with someone who is trying to figure out whether they are still permitted to live with honor. Tell us in the comments which moment moved you most and which city you are watching from, and consider supporting a Native American veterans organization near you, because they come home to landscapes that carry their own weight and deserve to be seen. Subscribe to this channel, and we will keep finding these stories.